Vladimir Putin has signed yet another decree that moves Russia deeper into the state of permanent war. On the surface, it's presented as routine training for reservists in 2026. In reality, it is a sophisticated attempt to draw ever more Russians into military service without announcing a new mobilization. Two crucial sections of the decree are classified. That alone tells you everything about Moscow's real intentions. The decree authorizes reservists to be called up not only by the armed forces but also the National Guard, the FSB, and emergency security units. Training can last up to 2 months. On paper, this is to protect critical infrastructure. The State Duma has even passed legislation to allow these reservists to be deployed in homeland defensive tasks. Yet the decree doesn't actually include any limit preventing their eventual transfer to Ukraine. This decision sits alongside an equally radical reform. Conscription will now run year-round. From January 2026, electronic summonses will be issued daily. Men are required to respond within 30 days or face severe legal consequences. What was once a twice-yearly bureaucratic exercise is now a permanent conveyor belt feeding the war machine. It removes bottlenecks, it removes escape routes, it makes the draft system a standing instrument of state pressure. Why is Putin doing this? Because Russia has taken staggering losses. Western estimates suggest around 1 million Russian soldiers have been killed or severely wounded since 2022. The Kremlin cannot admit that truth. Instead, it has built a marketplace for soldiers. Recruitment today resembles the gig economy. On Telegram, citizens scroll past adverts offering £25,000 signing bonuses. In some regions, the figure has reached 50,000. A broken finger earns compensation. A shattered foot earns considerably more. Debts are forgiven. Criminal records erased. Even HIV is no longer a barrier to enlistment. The result is a recruitment industry run partly by freelance headhunters who earn commissions per recruit. Regional governments compete with each other to buy bodies for the front. This is not patriotic mobilization, it's a desperate labour market that preys on vulnerable men. In the poorest parts of Russia, where alcoholism and unemployment define daily life, joining the army has become the last route to dignity. For some, the choice is stark. Die from poverty or shame, or die as a so-called hero. For those who survive, there is money and status. For many families, military pay is the first time they have ever experienced financial security. That is why Russia is able to sustain the war. The state is pouring roughly 40% of its entire budget into defense and security. Social spending is being cut so that the war can go on. Putin believes that Ukraine will break first. With year-round conscription and financial incentives, he's preparing for a long war of attrition and perhaps a wider conflict in Europe. And there's another important dimension. The Kremlin has learned from the trauma of the 2022 mobilization. Hundreds of thousands fled to avoid service. There were protests, there was panic. So the emphasis now is on slow coercion rather than sudden summons. Russia has slid into a condition where war is normal. Moscow has not declared a new mobilization, yet one is happening every day. Inside Russia, no one can pretend they do not see this. Recruiters swarm online, airport passports controls, scan draft evasion lists. Winter training camps are now planned for the second year running, even though this would once have been considered absurd. Putin is preparing Russia for a future in which the line between civilian and soldier is erased. What does this mean for the war? It means that Russia can continue feeding troops onto the front, even as it loses them at a catastrophic rate. Ukrainian officers report parts of the front where Russian forces outnumber them 7-1. Kyiv cannot match that scale without increased Allied support. Putin senses that time may work in his favour and that Europe might falter. The moral dimension is also impossible to ignore. The Russian state is exploiting those with no prospects. These men are not fighting for glory. They're fighting because the alternative is unemployment, debt collectors, prison. Many return home not as heroes, but missing limbs or in coffins registered falsely as deserters to conceal the death toll. Putin is trying to renew Russia's imperial capacity by consuming its own people. His new conscription structure turns every Russian male into a reserve resource of the state. The war has become a giant machine that takes the poor and the desperate and converts them into military output, and it sustains itself with the money saved from cutting hospitals and schools, because what's the point? They're just going into the meat grinder. This decree reveals Putin's confidence as well as his fear. He believes he can endure longer than Ukraine and the West. He knows he cannot win swiftly on the battlefield, so he chooses a strategy that only an autocracy can pursue: endless manpower, endless spending, endless denial of the human cost. Europe must understand the scale of what is happening. Russia is no longer in a temporary emergency. It is configured for war as a permanent condition, and that, if that continues unchecked, Ukraine will not be the last target. The question then is whether Putin is mobilizing. He already is. He already is. The question is whether we recognize it in time.